perhaps one of the questions that frame the whole panel is what is the advantage of approaching social security, social protection issues from a human rights viewpoint? As Isabel said, this dialogue, which is well reflected in the platform, in the social protection and human rights platform put forward by UNRISD and the other partners, is a convergence of at least three different threads. One comes from ILO standards, so standards regarding what is social security that come from the Philadelphia Declaration, from the ILO Constitution, particularly from ILO Convention 102, that kind of sketch what a social security system is, and maybe a step forward on that was the adoption of Recommendation 202 on social protection floors. Another thread comes from the human rights language, so human rights instruments and treaties, the Universal Declaration, the Covenants on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and other human rights treaties include the right to social security and other interdependent rights where social security is an instrument to achieve those rights, a right to an adequate standard of living, the right to food, and the right to health, and another right. So that's another source of this dialogue. A third source of this dialogue is what is known as a human rights-based approach, which actually doesn't come directly from an instrument, but comes from a general understanding of which are the transversal elements of what human rights mean. And this has been elaborated by special rapporteurs, the Human Rights Council, the treaty bodies, and by the UN agencies through a common understanding of what this human rights-based approach means. So what do these three things bring together in order to understand better the extent of the notion of social protection as a means to realize human rights? I think one important element is universality, the idea that every person, every human being has a right to social security and to connected rights, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to health, and other rights. This human rights element complements the traditional vision of social security systems as actuarial systems and the original view of social security systems as contributory systems, where the worker in the formal sector was the main protagonist of this whole narrative. So what we say now is every human being, regardless of the fact of being included or not in the formal work sector, has a right to social security, and ILO Recommendation 202 goes farther in that idea, just moving the focus from contributory systems to the idea of social protection floors that would reach everyone. Linked to that idea of universality is the idea that was mentioned by Katja, which is there are groups that are left behind, and these groups suffer discrimination. So part of the exercise here is just pointing out which of those groups that have been traditionally excluded from safe and secure places in the work labor market because of informality, because of the precarious, because of the conflicting obligations, such as in the case of women, or because of precarious labor market that only include partially certain groups. So which are those groups? And I think part of our discussion today is focusing particularly on the need to underscore protection to those groups. So again, ILO 202 does a little bit, ILO Recommendation 202 does a little bit of that, spotting specific groups that would need some measures that go beyond the general inclusion in securing income through labor market inclusion. I think another element that comes with this framework is the idea that social protection is a right, and that means that there's right holders, there are duty bearers, and there's a content of these rights, and there are certain institutional measures that should be put in place in order to ensure that we take them as rights, not just as charity or gifts from the state. So some of these elements are sketched if you bring together the perspective that came from treaty bodies like the Committee on ESG Rights, and are fairly well reflected in ILO Recommendation 202, the idea that there's certain obligation that comes from the notion of rule of law, so that the entitlements should be clearly stated in the law, that there should be mechanisms, recourse mechanisms or remedies when there's a violation, that the way in which you achieve the definition of this should include participation and consultation to all relevant groups, not only workers, but other groups, etc. So those are some transversal elements that have also been incorporated in this framework. Nuno mentioned interdependence, indivisibility. This is another issue that comes when you see things from a human rights perspective. When you tackle issues regarding social protection, you're not only tackling income issues, but you're tackling issues that have to do with the right to an adequate standard of living. Health issues and access to health coverage is another element which is inherent to the framework. And there are other rights that are connected to this, and many of the practices have linked, for example, cash transfer programs with the right to education or to other rights. The idea that people mostly use their income to overcome basic needs, so the right to food is usually directly linked to the securing a safety network. I think the last element to mention has to do with this institutional practice of developing programs that fit into these different categories. And I think the way in which these elements are explained and the examples that are given in the social protection and human rights platform are very good examples of best practices of how to tackle this issue. So just tackling this idea, we don't exactly know what this means. I think that notion of vagueness of economic and social rights can be overcome when you see that there are concrete examples coming from countries and even judicial decisions that have made these principles informed decisions in this issue. So, I mean, I particularly welcome the adoption of the network of the platform, which is really useful from a human rights viewpoint, and I think this should be a continued dialogue between the different stakeholders that are on this table. Thank you for your attention.